So, I'd like to talk about exploration as a game mechanic. And certainly, that was the main idea I had for Neverending Nightmares. I wanted it to be about exploration and less about conflict. With the enemies. I think that just the idea of exploring this virtual world and soaking up the atmosphere sounded really compelling to me. I think some people got it and some people enjoyed that, but I think the fact that I was sort of saying this is the this is the mechanic, this is what you're doing, didn't allow for much player control. And I think the idea of player control is important. And certainly it was a dangerous line to tread with Neverending Nightmares because we wanted to disempower the player as much as possible, which is very complicated to do, I think, from a design standpoint, and still make something that a lot of people are going to enjoy, and I think we did an admirable job. But I think, fundamentally you're limiting your audience, you're limiting your reach by creating something that disempowers the player, that doesn't really give them make them feel like a participant. And so I've talked to, if you go through the history of the developer diaries, I've done a lot. But in particular, I like to talk about the Telltale Games, and whether Telltale, they're even games or not, is interesting. And Warren Spector, who's a really smart guy, I got to attend a lecture he did once, and basically he says they're not games, and they're not games because they're essentially scripted, and you don't really have the player agency to create your own story. And your own story doesn't have to be narratively, but I think a lot of the stories people create are, I was fighting this guy, and then there was another guy right behind me, and I, backpedaled, but I managed to, reverse headshot right across the room, right? Like, that is a story that is user created. So, I think games are about that shared authorship. And I think, you can share your impressions of a Telltale game, and you can share your choices, but, and Warren Spector makes the argument, a certain amount of people are going to have similar choices. And so I think because of that, in terms of, exploration as a game mechanic, it's not really, a game by Warren Spector's definition, but I think, that idea of having the control is important. And so going back to Telltale Games, one of the ones that I think is really interesting to talk about is the Jurassic Park Telltale game. And I think Jurassic Park, I think it's probably safe to say it's one of their worst, it's probably their worst received game. And I think it's interesting to look at why. And, I liked it to a certain extent, but I could totally see why people didn't like it. And I think the main reason, is there was basically no player control. You could do some things here and there, but you weren't really driving a character. And someone else, I think, wrote an even smarter blog about it and said that, the character you were playing as kept changing, and you could play as two characters, fighting each other, and it was really confusing, which certainly, could be a big problem with the game. But at least for me, the shortcoming that seemed most obvious is just that you don't have that player control. And so I think, at that point in Telltale's cycle, the thing that was sort of missing to me was moving the character around. I think there's one instance when you can actually move the character and explore in that sense. And but there wasn't really much of that. And I think it's crazy if you think about, right, like, I played the most recent episode of Game of Thrones, and there's a couple times where you can walk around an area and talk to people and, inspect some items. And, they really seem kind of like throwaway, right? Like, the game... excuse me, the game could totally exist, and, the narrative would be the same, everything would be the same without those elements, but, I think it would be a much less fulfilling thing, and I'm really enjoying Tales from Borderlands, and it's super epic, but, there was a moment, I think at the beginning of the most recent episode, or maybe the one before, where I'm like, there's a little too much of this conversation. I'm not walking around. I'm feeling a little passive. And, certainly they made up for it, and they're doing some interesting, more like action-based things for Tales from Borderlands. But, there was a point where I'm like, okay, when do I get control? And I think the Telltale Games are really smart, because especially in Game of Thrones, I think there's very little of that, the walking around and stuff. I mean, it's a lot of, dialogue and dialogue and dialogue, but you feel like you have control, even if it's an illusion, even if Warren Spector is right, that you're not shaping the narrative, you're just choosing your own adventure, but you feel the weight of the decisions, and I think that's the real thing that Telltale does so well, is they give the decisions weight, especially in, Game of Thrones, where it's like, I can make these choices, some of them I feel okay making, because I know that, Tyrion I know what's going to happen to him, but, like, some of them it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen, and all these choices seem bad, and I think that really gives you a much higher emotional stake. But anyway, getting back to what I was talking about, is the exploration, I think, helps, and is something that works and adds to games, and certainly, I think if you look at something like Gone Home, exploration is the main game mechanic, and I think it works better in 3D, and I've talked about that, and I think it works better in 3D because you feel like you have more of a choice. You're navigating a character in 3 dimensions. You can do more things. You can explore and look at different things, whereas, with a fixed camera, like, because in my mind, Neverending Nightmares is sort of modeled after the Resident Evil style camera, but, I mean, we are sort of limited on, where you can go, and also, we tried to create a game without a mini-map and HUD, and maybe went a little too linearly. But I think, that it is still something that can be compelling, whether it's a game or not, again, is not interesting to me, but it can be compelling, and I think, the flashlight helps add to that, and we're also going less linear with our level design. I think we were really worried that people would get lost, and we didn't really play with sort of non-linear level design until Destroyed Dreams, which you may or may not have played. It's one of the 3 ending levels. I think you should definitely play all 3 ending levels. They're, I think, some of our best work. But that one we did more with, different paths and dead ends, and we wanted to feel like it was a maze. But we also had to be very careful to design it so that you couldn't basically accidentally find your way back to the beginning of the maze, because that's the worst, is when you get lost, and then you essentially have to start over. So that's why we were very careful to, lock certain doors behind you with the monsters, and also why we had you descend through the holes in the floor, because you couldn't go back up. And so it was a good way to say, here's a maze, space. How can we, sort of say, okay, you're done with this section. Here's another section. So that was our solution there. But I'm not ready to give up on exploration as a game mechanic. But I mean, certainly we're doing more with quick time events and adding more interactions in the world. We want to have you be able to turn the radios on and off, and just add those nice little touches with Devastated Dreams. And also the puzzles are going to add some depth there. But I think there's going to be a fair amount of walking around, a fair amount of seeing the sights, observing the atmosphere, and that's by design. And maybe not everyone will like it, but I think if Neverending Nightmares is any indication, I think we can really deliver on some cool walking around, some emotional, some good feeling exploration. So thanks for watching.